Let's talk about American Transcendentalism. We're going on now to read a couple of essays by Emerson, Self-Reliance and Compensation, as well as a couple of essays by Thoreau. All these are classics, I think. Civil Disobedience and Walking. But American Transcendentalism is quite a large-scale movement. In some ways, yeah, well, I think it's fundamental to American intellectual history. Um, Often, or for a very long time, it was thought to be the characteristic American philosophy. Um, at least it was regarded that way up until pragmatism, of which, these people are in some ways also progenitors. Um, okay, so Emerson was William James's godfather. So we'll get to the pragmatists fairly soon. Um, it's a self-consciously indigenous American philosophy. Indigenous, I guess, may be the wrong word to use here because these are descendants of British settlers, essentially, or European settlers. Um, and so Emerson, in his famous essay, The American Scholar, starts talking about how we need an American literature, American poetry, American art, American philosophy. It's time to declare independence and stuff, he says. Um, Now, it's also that's a little bit ironic because these folks also are characterized by a pretty good acquaintance with what's going on in European and British thought and literature in their period. Um, More aware than anyone we've seen, with the exception of Edwards, who was miraculously cosmopolitan for his period. Um, one thing that's going on actually, and this is how they come to be called transcendentalists, is that there is some influence, direct and indirect, on their thinking from German philosophy, Kant. Kant would be referred to himself as a transcendental idealist. Um, and maybe, a little admixture of Hegel. This comes from also through British figures, British romantic figures, maybe more directly through figures like Coleridge and Carlyle, Emerson and Thoreau, who, went to Harvard and, read Greek and probably read German and, maybe, several European languages actually. Um, all right. So they're calling for a characteristically American art form and forms of thought, but they're also, like I say, more in touch with what's going on in world thought, even Eastern thought. Even they're beginning to read Asian philosophy in translation, which I think we're going to see actually is turns out to be influential. They move directly, I think, like the fundamental story of how they come to hold the kinds of positions they do. They move directly out of the sorts of figures we've been seeing. They move out of American anti-Calvinist Protestantism. All right. And we've seen this very elaborately, including in Grimke, in David Walker, in Lucretia Mott, in John Woolman, in Anne Hutchison. Okay. All those figures anticipate the transcendentalists in various ways. In fact, Lucretia Mott, Thoreau calls Lucretia Mott a transcendentalist in a letter, although she regarded herself, I guess, as a Quaker eldress. Right. And so they have a number of things in common with those figures, including their individualism. Again, this comes to be kind of associated with Americanism in a certain way, although Lord knows it's contested and critiqued, especially by the 20th century. All right. But these are some of the most radical individualists you'll ever see. Certainly Thoreau and Emerson are. They're always on about that, actually, the power of the individual, the importance of the individual, maybe the sacredness of the individual. Those are things that they inherit from, from Quakerism, from Unitarianism, and from Protestantism in general, especially taken on in this anti-Calvinist direction where it's a lot more hopeful, man. People, I think they, are basically good. Like this is a Quakery thing, for example, and things could get much better. And in America, they're liable to, because this is a big chance to remake humanity in a way. They participate in this kind of idealization of America as humanity's next hope. All right. Almost ecstatically at times. I keep using the word ecstatic. They are rather ecstatic people. And they share the radical politics that we've seen too in Garrison, in Grimke, in Walker, in Woolman, okay? They're abolitionists. They are anti-authoritarians, soup to nuts, okay? Anti-statists. We might call them libertarians or anarchists. All of them, actually. Very skeptical of state power, specifically because of its violation of individual conscience. Just the problem Ann Hutchinson had with state power. Just the problem Woolman had with state power. Okay? And in particular, the constitutional provisions and legislation pertaining to slavery. This was a real convincer in terms of for this kind of almost individualist anarchist political approach. Like, you are taxing me to support or defend an institution that I regard as the most evil possible human activity, okay? Buying and selling one another. Violation of God's commandments, and the sacredness of each individual person involved. Okay, so all right. So the fundamental figure. This originates in like this transcendental club that met for a few years in the 1830s. Yeah, I think so. And it centers around Concord, Massachusetts, in a kind of almost unbelievable way. This is a little town, maybe you've been there, in Western Massachusetts, not in Western Massachusetts, near Boston, really. Walden Pond is nearby. And, Emerson, Thoreau, the Alcotts, including Louisa May, Nathaniel, Hawthorne, we're all living there at the same time. It's like Athens in the 4th and 3rd century BC or something like that. Like, you can't believe the gathering of excellence that's there. I personally think that Thoreau and Emerson are the greatest two writers America has produced, actually. That's my view. I'm not a huge fiction reader, so like other people are going to have other assessments. We haven't done much better than that, though. I don't think, writing wise. And unless it is some of these, Hawthorne, Melville, Whitman, and we can talk to some extent about what their connection is to transcendentalism. It's not perfectly aligned necessarily in all these cases. All right, the fundamental figure in American transcendentalism is Ralph Waldo Emerson. He's the fundamental inspiration, I would say, for this set of ideas or this set of moves. He comes from an eminent line of ministers, Unitarian ministers in Boston, and he was himself the most eminent young Unitarian minister in Boston, as a young man. And then he kind of went through a religious crisis, like a number of these people did actually, in one way or another, they came to be kind of uninterested in questions like the historical truth of Christianity. They were interested in the values, though, all right, and what values we should draw out of, say, a Unitarian spiritual orientation. But they came to be less and less interested in any kind of doctrines about God, really. Okay, for one thing, on the grounds of individualism, like don't tell people what to believe, let them conduct their own spirituality. So there's definitely a turn against organized religion here, and a turn against any doctrines, including those associated with Christianity, really. But there is also deep spiritual orientation to all of these figures, fundamental to them, really, I would say. Moving maybe toward a kind of pantheism, or even toward an Eastern, sort of an Asian-oriented philosophy of the identity of the human with the universe. Okay, they're reading that in a pantheist way, maybe out of the Upanishads and stuff like this. Okay. Yeah, and the fact that Emerson and Thoreau, were best friends, basically, I mean, Thoreau was Emerson's babysitter and his gardener. Emerson let him stay at the little cabin, or build a little cabin next to, on some land he owned at Walden. It was Emerson's property. Emerson and Thoreau write very similarly, although not identically, actually. Okay. But and in a way, I think both of their authorships, at least by the time Thoreau reaches maturity, are almost collaborative. I mean, they're swapping ideas really continuously and really hard. Okay. And just, I mean, maybe I'll just mention a couple other figures. Many figures could be connected here. And it's a fascinating scene. Okay, so Bronson Alcott, one thing that he was doing is transcendentalist pedagogy. He had experimental schools in Boston and elsewhere, and kind of innovated educational techniques which rested on respect for the children as autonomous persons. Okay, wildly loosened up the discipline. Like models of what came to be called, like in the 60s, I went to schools like this, free schools. All right. Or experiments like Somerset, you could look that up, I guess. Experiments in free education, free models of education instead of, pervasively coercive, compulsory education, which would have been rejected by all these people emphatically as obviously evil, actually, or a form of child slavery. And he's Louisa May Alcott's dad. And he was a very eccentric person and a very difficult person to deal with, and someone who really wasn't good with stuff like money or like mowing the lawn and stuff. He had instead incredibly high-flown metaphysical ideas, and also, concentrating on education, which he kind of subjected his daughters to his theories as well. Louisa May got kind of bitter about this, actually. She was raised partly at the ideal transcendentalist community of Fruitlands, and later she wrote about, is it called Transcendental Wild Oats, I think, about being raised by these rather eccentric people in this difficult context. But they're very interesting people, nevertheless. And they're not all as problematic as Bronson Alcott. Emerson was quite a practical person in a lot of ways. Thoreau, too, certainly. Okay. And I'll just mention Theodore Parker, very influential on all these people, very central to this whole thing. Very eminent Unitarian minister who ended up having a sort of crisis of belief And again, sort of saying like, well, I don't know about historical Christianity. I don't really care, actually. What I care about is the moral values and respect for individual persons that is expressed in Scripture and so on. He had an amazing congregation in his church, Theodore Parker, including a number of these same people. Okay. And he also, maybe sort of simultaneously with Thoreau, he wrote very similarly to civil disobedience, and he also did tax protesting. Like, he refused to pay his own taxes to support the Mexican War. And he argues very elaborately in a very similar way. These are very unknown texts, though, from Theodore Parker, that you have no obligation to obey the state. Now, in fact, you have a moral obligation to disobey unjust laws. And okay, so like Thoreau is not an eccentric when he does this. Bronson Alcott also went to jail refusing to pay his taxes to support the war, the Mexican War in the 1840s, which they all thought was being fought to expand slavery, and essentially was, I think. All right. Or just, express the imperialist ambitions of the American government, which were completely unacceptable. All right. So this is an interesting set of developments, I think, just almost in the spiritual path of, say, at least a certain part of America, or a certain portion of America. And one, I think the influence on American literature is immense. Just directly, Emerson and Thoreau they might not have written novels. They didn't write novels. Emerson wrote almost exclusively essays and a vast journal. And Thoreau, wrote nonfiction books as well as a vast journal and essays. Okay. But they were both poets, Emerson and Thoreau, and they both inspired literary figures as well as philosophers and thinkers and political figures as well. Emerson was probably the most famous American of the 19th century, with certainly before Lincoln shows up. He's known all over Europe. He's an incredibly beloved American sage. Almost all literate Americans, by 1850 could probably quote some Emerson and stuff like this. Like, he had very pervasive presence. Thoreau, on the other hand, was completely unknown during his own life, almost completely unknown. Had a hard time getting his books published, and definitely had a hard time selling them, getting them sold. Never made a damn cent on them. All right, but Emerson was touring the country and touring the world. All right, so he was considered the major figure. Now, Hawthorne lived in Concord for a while. The great Nathaniel Hawthorne, also one of the greatest American writers, certainly. Scarlet Letter, but his short stories are amazing, really. And he rented a house from Emerson. In fact, the same house that Emerson grew up in. And if you go there now, you can see where Nathaniel Hawthorne, scratched the names and birth dates of his children on a window at the old manse in Concord. Right out the back door was the first engagement of the Revolutionary War. This is some American shit, man. All right. And so he knew Emerson extremely well, and Thoreau too. Now, he probably had some reservations, certainly, after a while, about the Transcendentalists. He's not directly a Transcendentalist, but for example, he's obviously a critic of Edwards-style Puritan theology and theocracy. The greatest critic of those things, really. And, Emerson would certainly agree with that, man. Like, we definitely are not going in that direction. Emerson's whole like sort of spiritual orientation is defined initially in contrast to that kind of Puritanism that Hawthorne despised and exposed. Right? Melville is an interesting case. Certainly like the sort of absorption in nature that you get in a lot of Melville is interestingly connected to the Transcendentalists. I'll have to let some other kind of expert roll on that one. Walt Whitman self-consciously was a realization of Emerson's demand for an American poetry. And when Emerson read the first edition of Leaves of Grass, he interpreted it that way. Like, finally, here is the great American poet. And I do think that Whitman is a transcendentalist. One way we see this is, I mean, really maybe the ultimate question for Whitman is the individual and the collective conceived not only as a social collective, but as in terms of the connection of human beings to all sorts of things in the world, including each other, but also to trees and animals and rocks and earth and air. Okay. He emphasizes the social perhaps more than Emerson and Thoreau. But the ecstatic oneness, as well as the ecstatic individualism, simultaneously is the most characteristic feature of American transcendentalism, I say. I mean, the question of the relation of the individual to the collectivity, whether that includes non-humans or not, let's say, is obviously a huge fundamental question in political philosophy and stuff like this. The transcendentalists go for maximum intensity both ways around. Each thing is, and each person is individuated, made more different than anything else by its relations. So each thing is characterized relationally. The self might be nothing in itself. It's a bundle of relations, as Emerson says. Here's a quote from Emerson. A man is a bundle of relations, a knot of roots, whose flowers and fruitage is the world. A mind might ponder its thought for ages and not gain so much self-knowledge as the passion of love for someone else shall teach it in a day. So what makes us the individuals we are is the unique relations that each of us exemplifies, okay, or stands in to other things, to other people. No one else has my relationship to my parents, my children, and it's not only family, my neighbors, but also my little piece of ground out here, the walls around me, and so on. I am uniquely related, and that is what my individuality consists in. I'll give you one more passage from Emerson. This is near the beginning of his essay, The Oversoul. His word for God, really. Okay. The supreme critic on the errors of the past and the present, and the only prophet of that which must be, P-R-A-P-H-E-T, prophet of what must be, is that great nature in which we rest, as the earth lies in the soft arms of the atmosphere. That unity, that oversoul, within which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all other. That common heart, of which all sincere conversation is the worship, to which all right action is submission. That overpowering reality, which confutes our tricks and talents, and constrains everyone to pass for what he is, and to speak from his character, and not from his tongue, and which evermore tends to pass into our thought and hand, and become wisdom and virtue and power and beauty. We live in succession, in division, in parts, in particles. Meantime, Within man is the soul of the whole. Within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one, and this deep power in which we exist, whose beatitude is all accessible to us, is not only self-sufficing and perfect in every hour, but the act of seeing and the act of seeing and the thing seen, the seer and the spectacle, the subject and the object are one. All right, so maybe that has a little bit of Hegel in it. I don't know. It definitely has some Upanishads in it. It definitely has some Eastern philosophy in it. It definitely has pantheism in it. And it definitely has this hyper intense connection between individuality and connection or relation. So we'll be exploring all those things as we go on. I love these texts, as you might be detecting. Next week, on to Emerson.